Welcome back. It's been a while since I last recorded one of these. Long story short, I've been on holidays and I've been busy with traveling and relaxing a little bit, and so making one of these has taken a backseat. Now, today I wanted to discuss how the holidays went, both training and dieting wise, some diet strategies while on holidays, how heat impacts training, and finally, how my prep has gone since the last contest prep video. So first up, reviewing how the holidays went training and dieting wise. The holidays were enjoyable. I went to Greece, more specifically Crete, for 9 days, I think. The traveling was a bit stressful. The first flight to get there was at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. or something, which required me to wake up quite early. And then the flight back was at 1 a.m. till 5 a.m. So wasn't ideal sleep-wise. But otherwise, the holidays were quite relaxing. I definitely managed to unplug a little bit from work, and I came back from it wanting to work again. So I think it accomplished its objective or aim quite well. Now, regarding how holidays impacted training and dieting, first up, training, because that's the less complicated one, I guess. So training-wise, I stuck to my program as much as I could. It was my week 3/week 4 of my mesocycle, so pretty hard weeks volume-wise and proximity to failure-wise. I was training at RP 8 or 9 or 1 or 2 reps in reserve, and the volume was pretty high. I stuck to it pretty much perfectly with the exception of certain exercise replacements. So for example, I switched deficit sumo deadlifts for split squats, and for example, for RDLs, I didn't use a deficit, as you'll see later on in the video, just because the gym didn't really have any equipment that would make for a good deficit, and so you have to make do sometimes, and I adjusted things a little bit. But overall, I think I got pretty good training in, given the circumstances, and training wasn't really an issue. It wasn't ideal, but for a week and a half, it was definitely good enough, especially given how much volume I was doing and how low stress was, and just training pretty hard overall. If you're training enough and training sufficiently hard and recovering fairly well overall, the exact machine you're using doesn't matter a whole lot for hypertrophy. Obviously, there are differences between machines, and certain machines are better, but it's a detail compared to the broader strokes and the bigger picture. Now, diet-wise, the holidays also went surprisingly well. So going into the holidays, I was aiming to enjoy myself, and diet-wise or weight-wise, I was aiming to be somewhere between the usual rate of weight loss, so around half a kilogram to a kilogram a week, and maintenance. As long as I wasn't gaining any weight, because it's only, ultimately, the holidays only last 10 days or 9 days, and so even if I maintained for 9 days, cool. It's a diet break, I enjoyed myself, I had some good food, I relaxed. That wouldn't have been the end of the world, but at the same time, if I could lose some weight whilst I enjoyed myself, that was also welcome. And so I sort of set those two boundaries as being either I lose the same weight as usual, or I maintain. Anywhere between those two boundaries is fine. What ended up happening, I didn't really have access to a scale while there, and I didn't really track my macros. Like most of the restaurants, for example, I went to didn't have nutritional information or macros, and so I had to either estimate based on previous tracking experience or just eat according to satiety and hope for the best. I would say around half the days I was there, I tracked most of my food, and I made an attempt to estimate macros, and then maybe the other half I mostly went off of satiety and made some reasonable choices and ate intuitively. So it's sort of a combination of intuitive eating, tracking some stuff, and basing my eating off of sensible decisions and, again, eating according to hunger. So what happened was I didn't have access to a weight scale, so I didn't weigh myself during the holidays, except for once where I had access to the weight scale of a friend of mine. And when I left the UK before my holidays, I was around 94.5 kilograms, 95, I believe. Actually, no, I was more like 96, I think, 96, yeah. But then when I weighed myself over there, I was kind of expecting myself to be at least 96. It turns out I weighed in at 94 after having some food in the morning. And so I was like, okay, did I just lose 2 kilograms in like a week while on holidays? Which, in the end, that wasn't the case. Turns out, because while on holidays, typically your caloric density is a bit higher than usual, I was having less food weight than usual. So I didn't really lose 2 kilograms, but I definitely still lost some weight while on holidays. And so I came back to the UK and weighed around maybe a kilogram or a kilogram and a half less than when I left. And so ultimately, I did lose, some good fat while I was on holidays. Now, the way I did that was, again, I outlined my strategy as far as tracking and everything goes, but what I would typically do most days, and I mentioned this on Instagram, I believe, was I would have 1 or 2 meals per day be quite protein heavy. So an example would be like 2 small store-bought protein shakes, which would have like 50 grams of protein total with 300 calories. And then for a second meal, for example, I'd have fat-free chocolate milk, which would have 25 grams of protein and 25 carbs for 200 calories. And then for the remaining, usually 1 or 2 meals a day, usually 2, I would go out to a restaurant with friends or what have you, and either try and estimate the calories in the macros, or just essentially eat this tidy, and not be too concerned with calories, because by that point, I'd have had like 700 to 800 calories for the whole day, and my cutting macros were around 3,200 calories, so I had a big margin to make up for. But yeah, also staying quite busy during the holidays helped with making sure I didn't overeat, because I was busy enough that I wasn't concerned about eating all the time, and sometimes I'd go 6-7 hours without eating. In fact, while traveling back, because the flight was delayed and I didn't have time to get food before the flight, and when I got off the flight I was in London Gatwick, and if you know anything about London Gatwick, there's not a whole lot around that place, and so the nearest supermarket at 3 a.m. was a 50-minute walk. And so eventually what happened is I didn't eat for 20 hours straight, which wasn't ideal, but it means, makes cutting a bit easier, I guess. Now I wanted to discuss briefly what diet strategies I recommend while people are on holidays. I think diet strategies essentially fall on a continuum from no restriction at all to extreme restriction. And where you're going to want to fall on that continuum depends on your goals. In my case, I fell more towards the unrestricted end. While I do have pretty serious goals, like as I'm competing in bodybuilding in 9.5 weeks now, at the same time, I also have a lot of tracking experience. I'm pretty good with hunger management and intuitive eating. So in my case, it makes sense to be more so towards the unrestricted end. Counterexample, let's say someone was 3 weeks out from show day and they struggled with hunger management majorly. They didn't have much tracking experience, and again, they're competing in 3 weeks. In that case, being a lot more restricted makes a lot more sense. But then there's also a counterexample there. For example, when, let's say you're someone who has no plans of competing, you go on holidays once a year for a week, yeah. I don't see a particularly good reason for you to really restrict yourself, especially if food is a pretty important part of life to you. You may as well enjoy yourself, not be too concerned about what you're eating for a week, and then come back and you can take it more seriously once you're back. Because most people ultimately go on holidays to enjoy themselves and relax, and worrying about your food intake can be a bit detrimental. So it really depends on, I would say, your goals, your experience, how you deal with hunger, how good you are at intuitive eating, what food choices you have available, because sometimes, in Greece, for example, most things didn't have nutritional information, so even if I wanted to be really restrictive and track everything, I wouldn't have been able to anyways. So I think the exact diet approach you adopt should depend on your context, circumstances, and so forth. Next, I want to discuss how heat impacts training. You might notice in some of these clips, I am quite sweaty. That is because this gym, for example, didn't have AC, so it didn't have air conditioning, which is not ideal for a variety of reasons. On a more practical level, being sweaty and having sweaty hands, etc., just makes training a bit less safe, most likely, because stuff like dumbbells slip around your hands, you slip around on the floor, it's just not very enjoyable. On a more physiological level, though, heat while training is generally a bad thing, at least in the short term. So your body takes at least a few days to a few weeks to acclimate to more heat. So I'm, for example, used to training in an AC air-conditioned gym, which has around a temperature of 20 degrees Celsius. For my body to get used to training in 35 degrees Celsius with no AC, it would likely take it a few days or a few weeks, and during that time, you would see a different performance, and that's been shown in, or at least suggested in several studies now, from endurance training to other types of training. So long story short, your body takes a few days to a few weeks to acclimate to heat and to higher temperatures, and during that time, you can expect to see a dip in performance. So if you're going on holidays and you're training in the heat, which you're not used to, then I wouldn't expect your performance to be quite as good as usual. Just a heads up. What you can do to combat this is, effective hydration, so make sure you drink plenty of water, especially cold water helps, because that can decrease your body temperature somewhat. Then, ideally if you have a fan or AC, definitely use that. But otherwise, you just sort of have to accept a slight decrement in performance for a while. You could also use stuff like electrolytes in your beverages to increase hydration a little bit, but the main thing is just going to be time spent training in heat, and the more you do it, the more acclimated your body gets to it, and the better performance becomes. Finally, to end up this video, end up close enough, I wanted to discuss how my prep has gone since I came back from Greece. Honestly, since I came back, so during the whole of the holidays, I didn't really experience much hunger, or it didn't feel like an issue. Since then, however, I've come back. I've gotten back into the swing of things for a week now. Hunger has been more of an issue, and my energy / motivation to train and be physically active has dropped quite steeply, which is kind of to be expected, and I'm surprised it took this long, because I'm now, as I said, 65 days out, or 9.5 weeks out. So, it's good that it took this long for me to feel this way, but now I'm starting, I think, to feel the effects of prepping. The good news is, I only have 9.5 weeks to go, so I should be able to get through it just fine. The bad news is, it's still 9.5 weeks to go. Now, I don't want to read too much into this, because a few bad days doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, and it could just be a temporary thing for a few days. You have a few bad days and then you're back to normal. But for now, I've gotten back into the swing of things. I'm working a lot more on my PhD. I've gotten a lot of work done on my PhD. As I said, going on holidays has sort of renewed my focus and my motivation to work a little bit. So, done a lot of work on my PhD, been a lot more scheduled and planned out, and been using a lot more caffeine as well. I used to not take caffeine at all. Now I'm up to 400 milligrams a day, which for me is a lot. I use it primarily to enhance my work and to give me energy and sort of give me a better mood to be working, I guess. And also prep, I imagine, has made me more reliant on it, where beforehand I would be able to be physically active, get my steps in, and work just fine without caffeine. But now caffeine does definitely help. Additionally, caffeine might suppress appetite to a very small extent and maybe increase energy expenditure a little bit. Not to a great extent, but it's a small effect, but it's still an effect, so I'll take it. And I've managed to time it properly such that it doesn't really impact my sleep. I take caffeine when I wake up, and I take caffeine around 9 hours before I go to bed. Anyways, that about wraps up this video. If you stayed this long, thank you for staying and for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or any feedback, please leave it in the comments. Comment, like, subscribe. It helps out the channel. And I will see you again next week.